Welcome to the A to Z Running Podcast, where we help runners thrive. I'm Andy.
And I am Zach, and up next, the second installment in the Training Periods series, Aerobic Conditioning and How to Grow It. After that, World of Running updates featuring our exclusive Boston Marathon recap. Glad to have you back with us again, and glad to have fun watching the Boston Marathon recently, depending on when you listen to this. It may be yesterday, maybe a week ago, who knows. But point is, it was lots of fun, and we're going to bring that to you here a little bit today. That'll be swell. And if you're in the West Michigan area, how about that weather turnaround? Not just West Michigan, actually, this is like a nearly nationwide just swath of weather change. You know, it goes from like it was summer for almost a week to it's winter again in 2 days' time.
Snow, actual snow.
Literal snow falling.
It's crazy. You know that song, like, I understood the assignment. It's like Michigan didn't understand.
No idea what that
the
is.
assignment
Just referenced.
Like what seasons it should be. That it doesn't understand.
I mean, preferably somewhere in the middle would work well for most of us. But the point being, that was interesting.
Yeah.
And it also made for a lot of like figuring out how to run again in the heat, and then suddenly figuring out how to run again in the cold. Is kind of the way these things work, I guess, for runners. Speaking of the way things work, you've got questions, we've got answers, and we do that at the end of the month every month. And all you have to do to share a question, which we will feature and answer in the episode, is to go to AtoZrunning.com, look for the word question, AtoZrunning.com/question.
Yes, or you could follow us on other places and send us messages. That works too. I did want to mention that this is the time of year that people are often, if they're looking forward to a late spring, early summer race, you might be starting to think about jumping into races in late spring. And one of those races could be Riverbank Run. A lot of you guys are already signed up. Those of you that I've talked to in the West Michigan area, it's kind of a tradition. But those of you that are thinking about it, maybe the 5K, the 10K, or the 25K, you might want a discount code. And I have one for you. It's 10% off with the code RBR, which is lowercase, and then A to Z, uppercase 23. And you're probably not going to remember that. So
chances are the uppercase, lowercase doesn't actually matter.
It does. She said it's case sensitive.
It is?
Yeah.
Who makes a case sensitive discount code?
So I'm going to post that on our website, and then I'll share it sometime this week on social media. But Riverbank code RBR, lowercase, ATOZ, uppercase 23.
You're supposed to say the lowercase and uppercase before the letters. Lowercase RBR, uppercase ATOZ.
It's harder on a podcast to share stuff like that. But I do have a code. So you know me, reach out to me, ask for a code, I'll give you one.
It'll also be on the website. Go to AtoZrunning.com, look for episode 185, and you'll find it there.
Speaking of races and maybe hopping in very last minute, like super last minute.
Well, you could do that. If you haven't signed up yet, you need to do that.
For Rivertown.
On April 22, we are going to be there at Millennium Park in Grand Rapids. We're going to be there despite all weather, whatever it may be. And you definitely want to find us and say hello. We'll have a tent with stuff that's obviously us. And so find us, say hello, find out what things we're giving away and other stuff. And so it's going to be lots of fun.
It will be lots of fun. And you can get a discount using the code ATOZ10 for 10% off. ATOZ10.
In case you haven't yet registered for the race.
Yeah, I know. Some people wait. I mean, we've done that before.
I actually do it often until I started spending more time talking with race directors and realizing how inconvenient that is for them. So I try to do it less often now.
Yeah, but don't feel badly about signing up. We'd love to see you there.
We would. Even if you're not signed up, you can come.
Yeah, be a cheer squad.
Something like that. Well, we've got a lot of interesting things to cover here and a lot of time to do it.
Let's get on to our main topic.
Welcome to the beginning of a lot of time where we're going to share things with you. Andy says to me, she's like, why did you say that? A lot of time? And I'm like, well, I kind of meant to say something else. And I had a funny joke, and then it wouldn't have been funny anymore with the way I said it. So that's it. Now, speaking of interesting things. We recently began a series, and so if you are just tuning in, go back and listen to the previous episode, the most recent episode before this one, because that was the beginning of the series. And for those who did hear it, I want to give you the quick recap here. What we're trying to do is we are trying to break down the different periods in training as you break a season of training apart into periodization approaches. And so what are those periods? What do they look like in terms of success and some of the other things associated with that? We're answering a few basic questions about each of these training periods. What is it and why do you do it? How do you know that you have done it well? Like, what are the signs that actually tell you have successfully accomplished the goal of that period of training? And then also, so then what do you do to actually make that happen? So how do you actually execute the training to accomplish that goal? And that's what we're going to do with each of these training periods, up to and including race season, which for many of us is kind of like a week or two of racing. But race season is itself a training period, and what that can look like in a couple of different scenarios. So there's a lot of interesting practical content coming your way. And we started last week with the baseline, the foundation, which is the building phase or period, and often called base building or something like that, because what are you building? Well, you're building the base. So in that, we addressed very, very briefly here that what it is it's the musculoskeletal strength foundation. You're trying to build up your structure well enough that it can handle the coming training. So many would consider the building period to not actually be part of a given training cycle, but like the precursor that sets you up for the training cycle. And that's a good way to look at it, but I mean, all training is part of it.
But you're still spending
you're
good
still
time
doing the thing, training
running.
for the thing.
You're running quite a bit, actually.
In fact, you may well be. And so how do you know that your base has been built, that the building has been successful? Has to do with because you can jog for a long period of time without tiring or getting sore. So we're talking minimal effort. You're not doing hard efforts of anything, but you can do it for a long time. And it's reasonably comfortable, manageable. A long time, maybe like 2 hours. We broke it down more. Listen to the episode for the details. But and then the best way to get there, we talk about just a lot of incremental buildup of volume at a very low effort. Mm-hmm. So that's it. We call that the jogging period, you might say. The building period is the baseline for everything else we're going to do. If you don't spend the time building up your structural resilience like that, then it's much more likely you're going to break when you do some of the other things that are coming in training. Mm-hmm. So it's well worth the time, and how much time that takes just depends on the person. But if we don't do that, we're cutting corners that we ought not to cut.
Mm-hmm. This next part is the bread and butter of training.
I love it. The bread and butter. Yeah. It's probably the most common. That's the phrase that you've heard since the 1950s. I think Lydiard was one of the first ones who used that phrase to describe this type of training.
Bread and butter?
Yeah.
He did?
Oh, yeah.
Oh. What would you call it? Peanut butter and bagel of training?
Okay. Maybe. It's speaking of strange things that Zach eats. So, yes, what are we talking about here? Okay, you've built your foundation. Now you're ready for your aerobic conditioning.
Conditioning. I love conditioning.
You know, in fact, many runners do. And of all the runners that we work with over the years, it's frequently said to us that conditioning is like their favorite part of it, which is interesting.
It is interesting. I should say, though, I think that there's another common thread, which is the first time that they do conditioning, they don't necessarily love it. Yeah. And then they come to love it.
But then, yeah.
And also because of the gains that you get and understanding the training and really diving in and seeing what it can produce for you.
Sure. Yep. And it makes sense for many of us that it's not terribly exciting. And so at face value, a lot of people are like, oh, I got to do this for week after week, which we'll get to in a moment. But, you know, we tend to find as runners that we like routine and rhythm and such. And many of our athletes start to realize that they really like the familiarity and routine of the conditioning phase. And there's some other perks to it. But yes, this is good. Okay, so conditioning is the if the jogging period, if building is like establishing the foundation, conditioning is when you basically build the structure. You're creating the thing that makes everything you want to do as a runner possible. Okay. And so there's a lot more you can do beyond this, but the conditioning is at it in simple terms, the single most important thing you can do for yourself as a runner. And I'm not even just talking about long distance running. You could be a mile runner. You could be an 800-meter runner, half a mile runner. And I would still tell you the same thing. Conditioning is the most important, not the only important, but it is the most important thing that you do. And this is because your aerobic system is the engine that powers the machine, your body. It's the thing that makes everything work well for long periods of time at high efforts or high capacities.
And at low efforts.
Well, and yes, that, but I'm saying like as you scale through the whole thing.
With goals.
That being the case, it's when we talk about aerobic conditioning, included in the aerobic dynamic is like everything your body's doing, you know, the metabolic processes, your energy exchange, cardiovascular system, your respiratory system, you're exercising and strengthening all of those capacities and processes. And that's all contributing to the aerobic system in some sense. And so in that, conceptually, the aerobic system is theoretically, unlimited. You can always grow your aerobic system as a human until you get to the point where you are no longer able to grow at all. But the point being, your aerobic system has no conceptual limit. It does have a practical limit, though, which we'll get to in a moment. You
probably heard us say a couple of years ago, maybe even now, there is no limit to your aerobic ceiling. That's one way that we put it before.
Yep. You can continue. You can always push that up. The practical limit, of course, is that you can't always push it up very much from its current state over long periods of time.
With the physical limitations of our bodies to even like do the work that it takes to grow it.
Well, there's that. Yes. There's always that's going to be a key thing. We'll get to all that in a moment. But the point here is that all other things then, if you're talking about like anaerobic energy system, if you're talking about power and output, things like that, they all exist, you could say, relative to your aerobic potential. And so insofar as you train your aerobic potential, you make possible the other things at a higher level, which is why we say the aerobic condition then is the most important piece in that puzzle, because everything else is better the better your aerobic condition is. Whereas conversely, that's not true of other directions, where you could say something like your anaerobic condition, your anaerobic potential, does not necessarily contribute to your aerobic potential, and your anaerobic potential only exists as a percent of your aerobic potential, so that if the aerobic is low, the anaerobic can't be all that high by itself. So we won't go into the details of that specifically at the moment. That's a part of a different aspect of training that we'll talk about. But here, as we say then, your aerobic condition being the most important piece also takes the most amount of time. And so when we start to address these next two key questions here, remembering that this is going to be the place where we tend to just live as runners for most of our time.
And it's wonderful because season on season of conditioning can helps us to continue to grow too.
Always.
So that's also exciting.
More and more and more for longer and longer. It's good. Yes. Okay. So we've addressed then what it is and why you should do it, because it's going to make everything better and make you better. But also, it's like the thing that drives everything else. So now then the question is, well, how do you actually know that you are well conditioned aerobically, which is that's a Lydiardism. He always talked about a well-conditioned athlete, and then he would say a well-conditioned runner blank and say something about them, which is always kind of fascinating to me. That was the caveat to here's an expectation, right, where you would train like this and do these kinds of workouts. He would say a well-conditioned runner ought to train like this and do these kinds of workouts. And the assumption was always, well, in his mind, the assumption was always, if you're not well-conditioned, don't do any of that stuff. Just work on conditioning so you can get well conditioned first and then do some of this other stuff. And I should say that that's one of the areas that when we start to review training approaches and coaches over the years and things that they've done and such, there's some assumptions embedded in almost everything, and a coach doesn't always explicitly state those assumptions. And this is one that I feel like, thankfully, there's been a lot of clarity on from pretty much all training perspectives, you could say, but especially from some of the earlier ones that kind of laid the groundwork for most of the rest of them. So conditioning is then how to identify that you are well conditioned is essential, because this is the gatekeeper for the rest of what you might or might not do in training. And I say it that way simply because if you can never fully realize good aerobic condition in a training cycle, then you should stay in your conditioning until the very last possible moment, like maybe 2 or 3 weeks before your goal race. Just keep working on the conditioning, because it's going to be more valuable to you to do that type of work for your goal than to change over to something else prematurely. As a matter of fact, that tends to be the rule in training periods, where you don't ever move on to another period until you have addressed the full needs of the current one, because you're not going to gain as much from it if you do, which we stated a little bit in our previous episode. So we don't need to go too much more into that right now. Now, here's how you know. For the aerobic condition, we're going to look at 2 key indicators to tell us that we have a good condition. The first is your long run, and specifically, can you run an easy, comfortable rhythm, comfortable aerobic effort? If you're using things like heart rate monitors here, you can use them to kind of give you like a clarity on where your heart rate zone tends to be. I wouldn't use them for like precise, adjustments during the run, because heart rate monitors are not quite precise enough for that to be highly reliable. But the point is, you can use them to say to yourself, well, was I really actually running kind of in a middle aerobic effort range? And if your heart rate monitor says that you were like close to zone 5, nearly maxed out, and you say, well, but I felt good, I don't know if that's really truly easy enough. Maybe try easing back a little bit. But if your heart rate monitor tells you we're like low zone 1 and you're like, well, that was pretty hard, throw away the heart rate monitor. It's not helping you. Okay, so now here's the idea. Your long run needs to be long enough, regularly enough, that this is even possible, what I'm about to say. So this is where we say, for most marathoners, for example, they tend to do this approach where they slowly build their long run week after week or every other week until they get to about 4 weeks before race day. We are assuming that you are not going to do that approach if you're listening to us right now, because it's not very effective unless you are only training for 12 to 16 weeks before a marathon and you haven't been able to do other training to build yourself up prior to that. Then, of course, you do need to build slowly. I don't want you to go out and run a 20-mile run when you've not run more than 8 before. But point being here, it's more effective to run a consistent, high-volume long run week upon week for many, many weeks in a row than it is to like slowly build it up before a race. That's actually highly inefficient for the thing we're addressing here. So you're running your long run 2 to 2.5 hours, maybe. If you can't run that long for whatever reason, as long as you are reasonably able to achieve, and you're running it at an easy aerobic effort, to know that you are in a good aerobic state here now, your condition, that should be effortless for you most of the time. There are always situations where that is still going to be hard, like when it's hot and humid, or when you didn't eat enough or didn't get enough sleep last night, or you're not well hydrated. Things like that is probably still going to be difficult. But the point is, you should be able to run a 2 to 2.5 hour long run at an easy, a comfortable aerobic effort. We're not talking about jogging anymore, but it's like a reasonably easy run, and it should feel effortless, even to the point where the last 10, 20 minutes, you're still thinking to yourself, I got plenty of energy right now. Tons. Tons. So that's it. That's when you know, okay, that's telling me that my body is in a great place aerobically. And we'll talk about a little bit more what's happening there. But there's a second indicator. That's one that by itself is the most important one, but the second one that is very helpful.
This is at the end of conditioning.
Yes.
You'd be feeling
this
this
is
way.
Telling
Not the
you,
very
no,
beginning.
This is telling you that you have successfully done what you need to do in a
Yes.
conditioning period. Okay, so the first one's the long run. The second one is your steady effort runs, which is, we would call this under threshold type of effort. This is a little bit lower than aerobic threshold. And your steady effort is about an hour. You never really want to go longer than that in this point in time because it's not as efficient to do so. But an hour of a steady run once or twice a week, you should be able to do that and feel strong through the entire thing, never fading, and not be sore from it afterward. Generally, if you're sore from steady runs, it usually means you're running too hard for them. But you also might be a little bit sore from steady runs early in your conditioning work too. The point is, you should be able to run an hour at a steady effort and feel comfortable, strong, and controlled the whole time.
Not completely comfortable. You're a little uncomfortable.
You're at that line with steady runs where you're pushing, there's pressure on the pace, but you're not pushing so much that you're
in control.
Yeah.
You're not out of control at all.
And I'd still use the word comfortable because the uncomfortable starts at kind of the next level of effort up.
I think that there's also, when we, I actually just read something that Steve Magnus had posted, he had that conversation about toughness.
Yeah.
And that as you become a more conditioned runner, your toughness helps you be able to feel better and more comfortable at harder efforts. So, for instance, and the reason why I bring this up is because we're all at different points here. And so for me, I had only done easy runs for 2 years. And so...
What? For 2 years?
Well, or not running for half a year. But altogether, I hadn't been able to do hard efforts.
With the surgery, yeah.
With the surgery. I know it was a long time. You're like, what? That was a long time. Yeah. But when I got back to doing a steady effort, I was not used to being uncomfortable, and I had to grow my ability to be uncomfortable, and it's gotten better and better at the same effort. Mm-hmm. So I guess I wanted to put that out there because when Zach uses the words comfortable, you're not all going to feel that when you start conditioning.
But remember, I'm talking about the end, Andy.
Yes.
Right. So you are supposed to feel relatively comfortable at a strong, steady effort for an hour because that tells you that you have, in fact, grown your aerobic condition well. Otherwise, if you're not comfortable, you got work to do. That's kind of why Andy is making that clear here. You're right. So now that tells me, okay, I've got my long runs and I got my steady runs. I'm seeing those signs, and then what that means is that what's happening in terms of my aerobic system is happening efficiently and is happening at a reasonably high level of aerobic work, right? So the long run part is showing me my efficiency. The steady run part is showing me that I can be aerobically strong at a relatively high percent of aerobic maximum, if that makes sense, right? So, and that's a good thing. All of those things say, okay, your system is quite strong. So if our structure is strong in the building, our system is now strong in the conditioning, now we're ready for something else to help get us race ready, which is what we're going to talk about next week. So, and I should mention here, there's a couple things going on, where with the long run, a lot of times people will say, well, I feel like I'm running out of energy late in the run is one that we'll hear a lot of. So that tells us one of two things. Either one, you're going a little bit too fast, or two, you didn't eat breakfast or something like that. You should eat before long runs. You should not run long runs fasted. That's a bad idea. Unless you're running 30 minutes, 60 minutes, that's okay to run those types of runs fasted. But long
not fast,
runs,
slow.
yeah, but long runs, you need to have food in you because you need to have fuel that's available. But the thing we're doing here with an easy effort long run for up to around 2.5 hours is we are exhausting your available glycogen supplies so that your body is learning how to process efficiently all of its available fuel sources. So you will feel like you're running out of energy at the early stages. It's important to make sure you're not overdoing the efforts so that you aren't really truly totally spent before the end of the run, because that's a bad place to be. So instead, you go easy enough that you can get through each run, but you get to the point at the end where you just feel like I could run what's not really quite as slow as my easy runs usually would be, and yet just run it forever. And that's where you see that kind of progress in conditioning. Now, I should say, how long does that take? because this is we said this with the building. You have to take as long as it needs to take, right? And all of us are looking at the same, but I don't train for a marathon with an unlimited amount of time. I have a race date on the schedule, and I said marathon because that's the one that keeps coming up when we start talking about the long weeks. But whatever race you're training for, I have that on the calendar, right? And so I only have so many weeks between now and then. Well, preferably we wouldn't ever race until we were ready, but that's just simply not practical. We're always going to have a race that's on a schedule. We have to be ready by that time. So in theory, you want to give yourself as much time as you can to get ready for these things, but they have a tendency to take a certain amount of time. So we can plan reasonably well with this. For example, conditioning tends to take about 8 weeks. For most runners who have a good firm foundation, about 8 weeks is what you need. Sometimes it might take 10 or 12. Sometimes it might take like 6 or 7. I would argue that it's unlikely you can build good aerobic conditioning in under 6 weeks unless you've been doing other things that are really conditioning you well prior to you starting those 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. So case in point, we got a plan for it around 8 weeks for this to occur. And that means, as Andy and I were just kind of deliberating a bit on, well, should you be comfortable? Should you not? Should you be fatiguing at the end of your long runs or not? If we're talking about an 8-week period of time here where you're doing relatively the same thing week upon week, there's going to be some fluctuation in that time. The trend needs to move in a certain direction, and it doesn't move very quickly, especially at first. And you will say, you'll be doing something like this type of stuff, and you will say, well, I have been doing this for 3 or 4 weeks, and I just feel like nothing's happening. And I even feel like I'm getting slower, or like I'm just not feeling like I'm getting fitter at all. And my answer to you would be, okay, that's fine. Be patient. 4 weeks is not enough time anyway. Mm-hmm. And we really don't tend to feel results within the first 4 or so weeks. In fact, most runners will tend to notice results of their conditioning work after about 4 to 6 weeks. That's the range when you start to kind of feel like, oh, something's actually happening here. And that's okay. We don't mind that it takes that long, because if you're doing the right kind of work, then it is going to get there. And it's going to take maybe 8 weeks, but it might also take 10 weeks or 12, and that's okay.
And also, as Zach said, sometimes it will take longer if you are coming from like no running for 6 months.
Surgeries, time off, yeah.
Much longer. And we already knew this as I was kind of looking at the spring, but I'm not going to do all of the periods. I'm going to focus on conditioning, because my goals are not to run my fastest times, but rather to enjoy it, to get back out there. But I want to continue conditioning and do it in the right progression.
Yes, but also the because doesn't have anything to do with your goals. The because is because you need to be able to grow your condition to a certain degree before any of the other stuff's going to be worthwhile. And you don't have enough time to do that because you have to do it so much more slowly, gradually, coming off of things like surgeries. This is literal in Andy's case. So that's kind of the gist of, you know that it's there. You've spent that much time. You feel that way, especially on those long runs and steady runs. And that's gonna be a pretty trustworthy sign that you're ready to move on to the next thing. And I should mention, the next thing is when we start to dabble with race-specific types of things. That's when things get really exciting. None of that will help you if you aren't well conditioned. So do this first. Now, that brings us to our final question here, which is, how do I then train in such a way to build my condition well, to do that? And we've been kind of talking circles a little bit around that already, but it's important to remember that within the aerobic conditioning type of thing, I don't care whether you're going to race a 1-mile race or a 50-mile race or a 100-mile race. You could be an ultramarathoner doing the crazy ultramarathon stuff, or you could be a miler. And I would tell you to do the exact same thing for conditioning, no matter what you're doing. Now, if you're a 250-mile ultramarathoner, you've got a lot more stuff you're going to be doing before your race than just this conditioning, because this is not getting you ultramarathon ready long term. But it is, for a certain piece of the puzzle, doing something very important. For all of us, though, as distance runners, we need the same kind of thing for conditioning, insofar as it is the effective thing to do, and all of us need good aerobic condition. Then, once that's established, we've got other unique needs, depending on our races, that are going to be highly divergent. And then training is going to look very different for a miler than it will for a half marathoner or a marathoner.
How would you respond, Zach, to when people say quality over quantity?
That depends on the period of training.
Before conditioning. So let's say there's somebody who doesn't want to do as many of these long runs or these longer aerobic efforts, and they're like, well, I'm going to run faster and shorter.
You won't get in as good of aerobic condition, period. You can still aerobically condition yourself with doing less volume and higher intensity, but not as well.
As
and
efficiently.
Certainly not as efficiently. It'll take longer, in fact, and your ceiling is lower. You can't raise your aerobic condition as high without substantial volumes in certain capacities.
So that brings me to my question. For someone who doesn't have as much time, it is true that they would spend more time running maybe their easy would be at the top of their easy, or
maybe a little bit faster.
They would
sure.
they'd run a little faster, and then that would be a way to try to condition more without as much time.
Yeah. Yeah, very much is so. So there's a lot of examples of this over the years, and a lot of different reasons why people do things like this. And so one is things like time constraints, and others like health. You'll have a lot of runners who will say things like, well, I can't stay healthy when I'm running longer. It's usually because they're running too hard. If you slow down, most of those runners can stay healthy just fine. But there are cases where truly people can't run as much. And there's other situations where you'll have runners who are like, I tried running more and it wasn't working for me, but when I was running less at higher intensities, I was more successful. There's a lot going on here in nuance and complexity that can be explained, and there's a lot of good conversation to happen around this. But when it comes to what is the thing that is most likely to do what I need here, I need to be looking for ways to find the time to put in, and we'll explain about how much time that is, in fact, here in a moment. I need to do that if I can, and if I can't, I do have now, if I'm running less, fewer days, shorter runs, things like that, then naturally you can run them faster and without harming yourself, because you're not doing as much of total load. So that's where you might have someone who says, okay, easy aerobic running, it might be something between 50 and 70% of your heart rate reserve or maximum. And so if that's the case and I'm running a lot, I'm probably going to be closer to that 50%. But if I'm not running as much as somebody else, I could probably run closer to that 70% for almost all of my easy runs, and that's going to go just fine.
So this is a word of caution for those of you who are growing your conditioning, and maybe you haven't done higher volumes before, and you're stuck on my easy pace is.
Oh, that's a terrible.
But you were running that. But what I'm trying to encourage people is, well, you were running that at lower volumes, and so you're going to naturally need to slow down. You can't hold on to this. This is my easy pace, and this is what I will run when you are going to increase the load.
Yeah.
So I just want to encourage you all with that, because I do see some discouragement happening when people try to grow volume but hang on to what they think their pace should be for easy runs.
Yeah, there's these situations, and I've been involved in some of them myself directly, but have heard stories upon stories, and it's things like, you'll have someone say, well, this coach says like easy pace is blank, like for everybody. And it's like, well, that's silly. One, because the easy pace wouldn't be the same from one day to another for me, let alone from one person to another. So that's kind of silly. But also they'll say things like, well, you're not allowed to run slower than X. Like I don't want my runners doing slower than this for anything, whether it's a hard effort or an easy effort. And it's like, once again, that is a recipe for disaster. But insofar as we tell ourselves, our internal narrative around these things is just So fascinating to me. Andy and I were talking about this, in fact, while we were running together recently, which is something that we once in a while can do without fighting.
Victory!
Very rarely. But we did this
ours.
time. It was good. It was very nice. But as it goes, we're talking about this inner story, that the thing we're telling ourselves around all this kind of stuff. And this idea that like easy has a number to it is a bad idea, period. So get it out of your head and maybe throw away your watch if you can't. So anyway, that's a different topic. Now, let's talk about what this looks like. Aerobic conditioning, period, is, as Andy said earlier, it's the bread and butter. It's the point in your training where you're doing the things that are going to have the biggest effect on your aerobic system the most efficiently. So we're going to use that effective and efficient descriptor for all the stuff we're doing because you want it to be both. Efficiency means that you're actually like gaining in a reasonable pace, right? But also it has to be effective and do the thing well. So here's the Lydiard mix. I'm just going to give it to you straight. This comes directly from Arthur Lydiard. Why? Because no one has come up with a better combination for how to gain good aerobic condition. There's a whole lot of coaches out there with a lot of creative solutions for doing basically the same thing Lydiard said, but they provide their own name for it, and all of it is really the same thing. But this is it, and this is the foundation that has bred the most amount of improvement in the world of running and performance more than anything else that's out there. I guess you could say the super shoes maybe have a... But point is, as far as what we're doing in training, this is the thing that has had the biggest effect. And it's a simple recipe. First, you need to have your long run, and you want it to be 2 to 2.5 hours if you can. If you can't, as long as you can reasonably handle for a once-a-week long run. But you need to also be doing 1 or 2 other long, easy runs during the week. And it depends on how many days you're running. I'm not going to say everyone should be doing 3 long, easy runs, but 1 or 2 more in addition to your long run. And those need to be a reasonable percentage of your weekly maximum. So if your long run is like 20 to 25% of your weekly total running, those other ones need to be like 16 to 18%. So they're pretty close to the length of the long run. But there's a range there, as you can see. And so that might mean there's something like 90-minute runs, depending on how much time you're actually running in total in a week. But there are going to be 1 or 2 of those that are at an easy effort. And then, so that's the most important stuff. That by itself is kind of the baseline for what's deciding what you're doing in training during aerobic condition. You make sure you have those long, easy runs. And then the rest of it, now you say, okay, I can't run long and easy every single day. So what do I do that helps mix it up that is still highly efficient and effective for aerobic condition? Well, sub-threshold running is highly effective. Not quite as efficient as long, easy running, but you can't just run long, easy every day. So sub-threshold running, how long can you do that at an efficient rate so that it's repeatable regularly? Lydiard suggests that we got to stop at about an hour. And that's pretty much the way everyone's been doing it for the last 70 years. So stop at about an hour for steady runs and do 1 or 2 of those a week. You could do more than that, but it becomes less efficient when you do because you need more recovery time for runs like that if you do them too often. So 1 or 2 steady runs at up to an hour. And then you say to yourself, okay, now I have a lot of running at this point that's all fairly similar in terms of my neuromuscular activity. And so steady run, which is at kind of like a nice strong but still aerobic effort, and easy run, which is kind of like a mid-range comfortable aerobic effort, they're very similar neuromuscularly and muscle recruitment wise and all that stuff. So you need something to totally change it up a bit. And that's why Lydiard suggested doing a fartlek workout, not a specific interval workout, because he said a runner needs to go out there for a fartlek and just do whatever feels good. Not have an agenda, not have like you have to hit these times on these distances for these repeats. He's like, that stuff is bad. It's bad for 2 reasons. One, because it almost always discourages and demoralizes runners, especially during a conditioning phase when you are not super sharp as a runner. You're just not there yet. You're not like race ready. And so things like timed repeats don't generally look great on the resume during this period of time.
Or you coerce it to and then feel like junk.
Oh, yeah.
Afterwards, like taking too much recovery time.
Right.
After.
So, fartleks are great for this other than option, which is a more kind of open-ended, you're going to do some short, fast stuff. And the way Lydiard would describe it would be do a fartlek of like 1 to 5 minutes of harder kind of running. I don't know exactly the words that he used because he kind of used a couple different words throughout all the time, but like faster striding would be one phrase that you use a lot. And how fast are you going for those? Well, it's just kind of like whatever feels good. The shorter it is, the faster you can go and still feel, reasonable. And so you just kind of, if I want to go a little bit faster, then I'll go shorter and do something real quick. And if I want to go a little bit longer, then I'll ease back a bit. I won't be too aggressive here. And then the key is between all of those short, fast things, I'm going to jog or run easy as much as I need to before I am ready to do it again. As much as I need to. Mm-hmm. And so rest can be a minute. It can be 7 minutes.
Mm-hmm. And if you're like me, when I started out, I was not giving myself enough recovery in between. So a suggestion, which breaks away from the heart of this, but hopefully you can train yourself out of it, is to at least give yourself as much time as the hard effort. So like if I go for a minute hard, I at least give myself a minute easy, or like 3 minutes. Like I was overdoing it because I was going like 30 seconds after a 3 minute. So just kind of giving yourself that amount of structure more for the recovery to be effective. Yeah. But hopefully as you do this more and more, if you do 8 weeks of conditioning, by the end, you'll be able to feel like, okay, I'm ready for another one. Because the goal, again, and you hear us say it all the time, is to become intuitive to what it feels like. So I know I'm recovered now, time to go again.
And remember, the purpose of this run in the context of what you're doing in your conditioning period here is the neuromuscular stimulation. Is the highly variable neuromuscular stimulation. You're trying to do things that are different from your day-to-day training regime. And so that high variability then being the goal doesn't really matter exactly what you're doing as long as it is something different and high variability.
I like to say that it's very varied.
Okay, that's true.
Very varied.
So then, what's the best way to do that? Get rid of the watch, which seems to be the best way to do everything. So why don't you just get rid of your watch? Stop letting the watch have any role in this, and just go out there and run. And when you feel like, okay, I'm ready to kind of do something a little quicker, and decide for yourself, how hard do you want to go? How fast do you want to run for that? And then start doing it. And as soon as you start to think, I'm starting to kind of feel this a little bit, immediately ease back out of it and jog for a while until you feel like, okay, I'm ready to do something different again. Now, since I did that last time, I'm going to do it a little bit different this time. And I'm going to try something a little bit stronger, but not as fast. And so I'll go longer.
It could also be looking at what you need, the thing you need, too. So, for instance, like if I'm feeling dull, maybe I need to do some shorter ones.
I mean, if you're feeling dull, you've got some other things you should do to work that out.
No, but I think that it's important to think about, like, so I've been doing a lot of long, steady stuff, and I'm feeling kind of lethargic. I probably should interject some of that quicker stuff, even though, because we talk about, like, just do what you want to do, but also keeping in mind, like, what do I need? So getting things popping might be what you need, because that's where you are feeling the biggest amount of challenge.
Yeah. That's the point of this workout, is to be the thing that's different to meet that need from the rest of the work. So you want to do that once a week. Mm-hmm. And you really don't need to do it more than once a week. And if you miss it here and there, it's not the end of the world, but that's kind of an important piece in just keeping yourself, your body not just starting to like feel drudgery. Mm-hmm. So
and we always tell you to try to do your harder efforts like without distractions. However, if you are really fatigued, you're really tired, like mentally, emotionally, I have found that I've had some good fartleks with music.
Okay.
Where like I just randomly do it in different parts of the music that is exciting to me.
You listen to like some dubstep, and then every time there's a drop, you hammer. You
I mean, I feel like that can be a fun way to bring life back into it. Although it is very important to be able to do it without distraction and it's important to be able to hone in on some of the form things and like dial in. If you're tired and you like need to interject some fun, I can tell you that this can be a way to help you do that.
That's good. All right. Good suggestion. Okay, so that's the combination you need. That's the Lydiard approach that everyone else uses but pretends they don't. And then there's a lot of different considerations. How many days you're actually training in a week might define exactly how many of these things you do. What goes first? You know, if I'm not running 6 days, because what we just laid out there is a minimum 6-day kind of structure. Well, if I'm not running 6 days, so what do I cut out first? Those are important considerations. All great questions to ask for the end of month Q&A episode, in fact. But if I may, there's a couple pitfalls that we have to avoid here with this. And you're going to see in most kind of contemporary training schedules that you're going to just find generically out there, they like to take that fartlek and turn it into a structured interval workout. They do that because it's easier to recommend and write on a piece of paper in a small box. And a fartlek is really hard to write in a small box because no one really knows what to do with it unless you write a lot of words about it to explain it.
There's talk about it in a few podcasts.
Talk about it in episode 136. That was our fartlek episode. Or no, that's a how to train by effort episode. Sorry. Anyway, so we've got these training schedules out there that put in these interval workouts out of convenience. Also, they've convinced themselves. I'm not trying to belittle these things, but in the way I'm saying it, it sounds like I'm not belittling them. But they've convinced themselves that there's a better way to do that fartlek. When I say, okay, at this point in training, mile repeats would be great, but then later on 400 repeats would be great. And so this is better because it's more like dialed in, which is not true because that's not the point of the fartlek workout. So once again, repeats can accomplish something similar to the fartlek, but their coercive nature and their overly structured nature suggests that they're almost never going to be exactly what you need except for by sheer luck. And we just don't like that in training. We like the thing to be what you need by design. And so the fartlek is the best way to do that. You should not be doing interval workouts, structured interval workouts during a conditioning phase because that's not going to help you get across this finish line as well. So there's that. Now, the other thing that people are doing is they're running long runs hard. And you can't do that during this phase. You can possibly. It's just a bad idea because there's plenty of time for hard long runs, especially for those of you who are doing like long distance races and you feel like I got to be able to run hard for long. Well, you're right. You're going to do that later on. But that's highly inefficient for conditioning because it demands increased recovery time and it reduces the training effect of the other stuff you're doing. So unless your long run has 2 or 3 days of some pretty lightweight stuff afterward when you're doing it hard and you're not already well-conditioned, remember what Lydiard always said, a well-conditioned athlete can run hard long runs or run progressive long runs or fast finish long runs. A well-conditioned athlete can do that to great effect, which might in fact be a direct quote from Lydiard now that I think about it. But the point is, yes, that's possible after we've done this stuff. Don't run your long runs hard during your conditioning because it's going to reduce the benefits of other stuff you're doing and potentially risks things like injury, over fatigue, all that type of stuff. And then that just goes with everything. I mean, just don't run anything too hard, especially during conditioning. The default mantra here is always, if in doubt, go easier, because too easy is always more effective than too hard for training.
I know it seems like it's counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Well, no, though, it doesn't, because the consequences of too easy are that you just get a little bit less of a training stimulus. The consequences of too hard are that you break or you get demoralized and demotivated from cognitive fatigue or central nervous system fatigue or all the other stuff. Going too hard has tons of risks and very few rewards long-term
in conditioning
at all. Mm-hmm. I mean, ever. We're talking about too hard. Yeah, ever. But, we seem to have this just do it mindset that Nike has ingrained in all of us. That's not so good. Well, there we have it. So your conditioning is the thing that must demand the majority of your focus, and you have to be willing to contribute, to commit to however much time it takes, because this is the thing that's going to make you the most positive impact on your overall fitness progress. Comes from this work right here. And it does happen This is why if you don't deliberately do this, you say, well, yeah, I was doing great, though, and I didn't do conditioning. Well, this does happen when you're doing other stuff. It's just not as effective unless we dial it in a little bit better. So there you have it.
And I always like to tell people, you can still be fast in conditioning phase, like if you do throw in a race or something. Because
Andy ran her mile PR, lifetime 1 mile PR, during nothing but a solid conditioning block.
In my 30s.
I will contend that it was freakish when she did that. However, she's not the only person that we have coached who has done that exact same thing, a mile PR during conditioning phase. And it has nothing to do with the fact that the conditioning is doing something good for mile running. It's just that they're in good aerobic shape. And a mile is still an aerobic run, despite what anyone else wants to say. All right. Well, there you have it. Now you know, and you get to hear then next time around when you are well conditioned aerobically, now what does it look like to strengthen and coordinate for a focus race? And it's going to be really exciting.
Very exciting.
Join us on that one next time. But before we wrap things up, we've got a Boston Marathon recap coming at you next.
To kick things off in the world of running, we have congratulations in order to some A to Z runners. At Boston, Jacob ran a PR.
A PR.
An amazing PR.
At Boston, which is not an easy thing to do. On a year when it really wasn't the greatest conditions.
Yeah. I mean, there was a little bit of a headwind. It was humid. So Jacob ran a PR. Spencer and Andrew, Brandon, Mary, and Dan O all ran really strong marathons, too. Everyone had a strong day.
Great running.
Great
all
running.
Around. It's because they're coached by... sorry.
Because they did the work, and then they did some good conditioning, too. And then we have Marissa, who ran a half marathon in Michigan. And then Martha ran a 5K.
Lots of fun racing over the weekend, and even more next weekend. So you're going to want to hear that update too.
So congratulations, everyone.
Congratulations to all.
And congratulations to those of our listeners who are racing this weekend too.
Yeah, and many of you racing specifically Boston. So nice shout out to all those. How many? 30,000? Is that what they said? How many were in the race this year? All those who, the so many stories we hear, the lifetime dreams of qualifying for and finally reaching Boston and being able to have the experience fulfilled. Sorry you had to do it in rain, but it's still awesome. And just it's one of those events that as far as the running world goes, kind of feels like a moment. There's most races people don't even realize are happening until they hear something about it. Boston is one where it kind of has some gravity to it, which I like that because running doesn't have enough of that, I feel. But this one's fun for it. And, how many years? 127 years, oldest marathon. That's cool. That's fun.
That's very cool. 127? Well done. Did you say 127?
127.
Yep.
Well done to all of you who did and who do and who will. This is good.
And those that don't or won't, you're still a runner and you're still valuable. And I know it can be frustrating. So I just want to put that out there.
Listen, we've never run Boston.
Yeah, but I just was saying, it can also bring up some feelings and emotions, and I want to recognize that, and you can feel that. But I do want you to let that go, and for you to feel that you are a runner and you are valuable, whether you ever run at Boston or not.
That is true.
Yes,
you're just not quite as blue and yellow as people who do. Because everything's blue and yellow at Boston.
It sure is. Okay, well, now, let's get on to our recap.
Let us all together join in some fun spectator moments. So the Boston Marathon this year was a hyped race like few other years in recent history. And there's many reasons. One of them was the king himself, Eliud Kipchoge, running his first and probably his only Boston Marathon. And there's some hype around things like that. But on the men's side, it wasn't just Kipchoge because there were a lot of other, just tons of headliners. Evans Chibet returning from winning last year on his win streak. He won Boston 2022, then New York 2022, and then back in Boston 2023. So we got some big names coming across certainly, and many others in terms of the international accolades were all over the place. But then, for some, we've got some up-and-coming young marathoners, too, making some appearances that are just exciting for people in the U.S. Connor Mance, his second marathon only so far, but his debut, was really fast, and there's a lot of promise in that young tyke. And then we've also got the likes of Zuhair Talbi, who is debuting in Boston and and has been a highly successful track runner. But, as many do, he's just feeling like maybe his potential is in the longer stuff and wants to give it a shot. So that's going to be an interesting one here we'll mention. And on the women's side, perhaps an even more hyped race in terms of the depth of field. This is a crazy field. But you've got the likes of Hellen Obiri doing her second marathon and kind of like a revenge tour after she felt like her first was not as well representative of what she could do.
Ababo Yashana.
Yashana making yet another strong appearance. You've got the world champ marathoner, Gotitam Ghebreselassie, from 2023. You've got on the U.S. side some big names. Sarah Hall's in the race. Emma Bates in the race. Among Des Linden, previous Boston Marathon champ. And so just so many exciting things.
Well,
Meb
that was
just announcing. What?
I was like, this is just Zach hyping up the section. We haven't even gotten started in the section yet.
I'm doing this on purpose because it was one of those that just had a lot more anticipation than a normal year.
I would have to say that is definitely true.
Now, then the race started. Mm-hmm. And in the men's race, it started exactly like you hoped it would have. Blazing fast, out the gun. Their first mile was 4:37, which is about 2:01-ish pace. So, yes, world record pace. Of course, Eliud Kipchoge is leading that charge. He's the one making that happen. Well, he did say ahead of time that maybe he might go for the world record, or at least the course record was kind of the way he framed it. And so, yeah, they go out in a 4:37, and they're just doing it.
Yep.
But here's what's I find just to be entertaining. It was like a thick pack of guys at this crazy fast pace. And I'm watching this thinking to myself, you're just all sitting there hoping someone's going to slow down right now.
Mm-hmm.
And you just continue hoping that way longer than you should be. And that's kind of the nature of it. Mm-hmm. You had Connor Mance, USA, and C.J. Albertson both in that lead group. C.J. Albertson is no stranger to going faster than he should in the early stages of the Boston Marathon. You're familiar with that in recent history.
He stands behind that strategy.
He does. I think it's more of a joke than a strategy now.
No, I don't know.
But he just feels like he's got to go with it because if you can be known for anything, you should be.
Well, he feels that his downhill running is so strong, he wants to take advantage of it in
well
the
aware
early
of how
stages.
He explains it publicly.
Okay.
I am not convinced that that's really the thing. I think he's just tripping and loving it. So that's my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
C.J. Albertson, call me wrong. All right, so those two were in it among another 9 or so guys.
Mm-hmm.
So they go through half marathon, not quite as crazy fast. It slowed actually pretty quickly after about 5K. Which, they went through 5K in 14:17.
14:17.
Which it should be noted, to the second is my personal best on the track in a 5,000 meter. So I know exactly how that feels and would never dream of doing it any longer than one time. But they went out fast. And so they started slowing and pretty quickly apparent that they were not actually going to go for the world record. If Kipchoge thought maybe he would go for it, he realized early in the race that it wasn't a great idea. So they slowed to something reasonable. They were still fast at the half, 62 and change through the half, which is quick, especially at the Boston Marathon. But remember, the first half of Boston is the fast half. So it's still not uncommon for the race to be quicker like that.
Yeah, but it was close to some of these guys' PRs in the half. So
yeah, that's true.
Which
happens.
That's quick.
It happens. Let's see. Connor Mance, what did he do? He came through 25K. Here's a good stat for you. Connor Mance, USA, came through 25K.
2 seconds.
20 seconds or so. 12 seconds?
I thought you said
20 seconds slower than the U.S. 25K record.
Oh.
That Parker Stinson holds. So the second fastest 25K all time in the first 25K of his second marathon. And I thought to myself, I'm not so sure you're doing what you should be doing right here, man. But anyway, that was pretty crazy. Now, if we kind of break it all down and we get down to the thing that everyone's talking about, somewhere, I don't know exactly where it was now because we didn't write it down, but somewhere in the second, the final third of the race, Eliud Kipchoge suddenly did not look good anymore.
It was in the hills.
It was.
Yeah, it was in the hills.
Now, I have. Everyone has their thought, right, on this. However, there's two things that we know with certainty about Kipchoge. He does not love running hills, and he does not love rain and humidity in general, but rain. And he had both of those in this race. And I contend that those things are weaknesses of his. Not always that he loses a race in them, but he doesn't run as well. And he struggled in the hills. He simply did. So Kipchoge faded. Yes, the king was dethroned again. This is only the second time he's lost a marathon in the last several years, but yeah, he did. He ended up sixth or so, right? So he still did well. But what ends up happening after that, though, is what's really exciting. So it's Gay, who puts on the move to kind of like, we're in the hills, things are getting challenging. I'm going to make sure it hurts more. And he starts kind of putting some pressure on, and the pack breaks apart pretty quickly. But then you've got the defending champ, Evans Chebet, and training partner Benson Kipruto, who are both right there in it and quickly overtaking. And then Chebet ends up putting on some pressure. And that starts looking like, all right, defending champ wants his laurels again. And so he's driving a bit. But then he doesn't hold very well. So they catch back up to him. He looks like maybe he's going to kind of drift behind them. And then starts surging again a little bit later. So, like, the race gets just interesting. Last several miles were really fun to watch. So what ends up happening as it goes down, it's a late-stage move by Evans Chebet to take the defending crown, which apparently is the first time since 15 years ago Robert Chariot did it, in fact, in 2008. So that's really... Bless you. That's really impressive. Evans Chebet doing a thing that's very uncommon, but he is like on the prowl right now. Because not only did he just win his second Boston Marathon, he just won 3 world majors in a row, Boston, New York, Boston, and has now won 6 out of 7 of his marathons since 2019. So in the last 4 years, he's actually only not won once.
That's a really good winning streak.
Now, arguably, you could say, well, he's racing all the races that Kipchoge wasn't racing. And so, naturally, both of them won almost all of their races since 2019. However, if you put them head-to-head, guess who has the better record head-to-head in the last 4 years? Evans Chebet. Fascinating. So Let's Run started to say, Chebet, the new marathon king. I'm not so inclined.
It might make some people angry because of the love of Kipchoge.
Well, he's definitely a lovable guy.
He is.
He deserves his adoration.
Yeah,
he's
but we don't really, we don't know Evans Chebet as well. Like, he's not.
Well, he's not the public
in the
figure
limelight quite. Well, he is in the winning sense, but he's not doing as many interviews and things. It seems.
That's because he's not Kipchoge. Kipchoge's the only one who does that kind of stuff. Well,
yeah,
anyway.
I think Let's Run said it's hard to argue against Chebet as the world's best marathoner right now, an unofficial title that belonged to Kipchoge for most of the last decade. So they were saying, as Zach said,
Let's Run feels like he should get the crown because of what he's been doing. I think I see the point. It's just, you never really commit to these kinds of things until after it's already happened because you just don't know what's going to happen. But we'll see. So Evans Chebet just making them all work for it. And there was a battle for second. I should mention Chebet was it third fastest time in Boston history?
Yep, third fastest time.
I mean, props to the early work by that pack. But Chebet just through the hills was strong.
And there was no pacer, so Kipchoge was essentially the pacer.
Yeah, there are no pacers for Boston, which is another one that some marathons will still do pacers, but they don't. Now, he went 2:05:54, which is fast for Boston. That course is not a fast course, unless you have a tailwind, a strong tailwind, which does happen once in a while. But so 2:05:54 is not a terribly fast time in elite marathoning these days, but at that course is very fast. And then it was only 8 seconds back, where second and third were battling it out, kick to the finish. ends up being about 10 seconds back, I should say. And it was Gabriel Guillet who won over Benson Kipruto in a 2-second line between them.
Which is really quite a fun kick for the end of a marathon.
Yeah, good stuff.
The first American was Scott Fauble. He was 7th place for the 2nd year in a row. He got the same place.
You know, he is so good at racing Boston.
He is.
It would be great if he could be so good at racing any marathon. He seems to be way better at Boston than other races. Not all of them. I mean, so Scotty Fauble's done great in marathoning. He ought to have more accolades than he does, and yet has not been able to put it together like at the U.S. trials or something. But
well, we'll see. Maybe he will.
I would love to see it.
Yeah, and he overtook Mance in the final mile. Running
late stage.
Yeah, running a 2:09:44. I didn't write this in here, but Matthew McDonald also overtook Mance.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And arriving before Fauble in 5th place was previous podcast guest Zuhair Talbi. As we mentioned
in his debut.
Yeah, in his debut. Zach teased that earlier. So that's an incredible performance by him, and a 2:08:35 as his final time.
Yeah, so Talbi, Moroccan, has, in a post-race interview, described as a pretty clear path to the Olympics now for Morocco in the marathon. And he's just looking to keep it up. He's definitely inclined now to continue.
Yeah, he's like, I can say I'm a marathoner now. Yeah. And someone asked if he was gonna go back to the track, and he's like, no, not right now. Obviously, like he's not gonna do track season. But that I feel like that was kind of expected with this success here, and then the money that can be made on the roads, and then of course, if he's looking to gear up to represent Morocco at the Olympics, he's gonna want to get another marathon under his belt.
Yeah, and he likely will.
He said maybe the fall. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's good. He was 5th. We mentioned then between Fauble and McDonald, there were 2 Americans in the top 10, and Talbi finishing 5th in the top 5 was just an incredible performance.
Really, really good. Yeah. And he also did beat Eliud Kipchoge. So.
He did. He caught him late in the last. It
was interesting because the interview wanted to focus on that, and he
was
just like, well, I'm not like.
They wanted him to talk about like what happened to Kipchoge, and he's like, I don't know, I wasn't even there.
He didn't say I don't know.
He was up ahead of me.
He actually did it very gracefully. He just talked about his own race. You can't discuss someone else's race. He doesn't really
someone
know,
else's race that was happening somewhere where he wasn't at the time.
Yeah, but he didn't even focus or relish the fact that he beat Kipchoge. He's like, well, he was obviously struggling. It was not a good day for him. So
this is the way this goes, all right? For all of you watching who are inclined to say things like, you beat Kipchoge, that's amazing. Okay, this is how a runner thinks, all right? If I beat you when you are on, I've done a great thing. If I beat you when you are off, I have not done anything. You were not on. So it doesn't matter that I beat you. But you can
still enjoy your great day.
I am well aware of the fact that you can enjoy it still. Yeah. But when a person like an interviewer goes up to runners like, so how do you feel about beating? So I beat Dathan Ritzenhein in a race once. Do you know that, Andy?
No.
I beat Dathan. I did. Because he dropped out. And so someone says to me like, you beat Dathan. I'm like, no, I didn't. He didn't finish the race. But he was at the start line, and in the results, I finished ahead of him. I'm like, no, I didn't.
Because it wasn't a race.
Right.
Really. Yeah,
so that's the way a runner will think in this situation. The interviewers should stop asking them that question.
But I should mention that I felt like Talbi had a very insightful perspective on it because he didn't talk about the competition.
Yeah.
He was essentially saying, like, I can get better at this sport. Like, not when I beat this person, I have arrived.
Right.
Which I feel like is way more healthy to see yourself in light of the things that you can progress towards without the influence of others or their abilities, because you can't control that.
Yeah, and I should note that there's kind of like one exception to all of this in general, and that's in Evans Chebet situation. By winning that race and winning that race where Kipchoge was in the race, that necessarily in that moment doesn't define like that he's so much better than Kipchoge because he beat him in that sense. But what it does show is that he is at a level now where he is beating the world's best marathoners. And you could say things like that. That's certainly very true for Chebet here. So never discount the accomplishment, but at the same time, it's not the right question for like Talbi in that situation.
Well, I can't wait to discuss the women's race because, again, it was riveting. The women's race went out the opposite of the men's race and went out slow.
The exact opposite. It was so slow that they looked like they were bumping into each other in the first mile.
Yeah, there was quite a few women. In fact, only 16 women, only 2 seconds. No, it was 26 women, only 2 seconds apart.
Yeah.
So they were all like super close, and it's fast relative to their speed. So like I'll say this time and you'll be like, that's actually really fast. Well, for them it's not. So they went through the 5K at 17:48.
Yeah.
Which for them is slow. It's just really hard to even say that.
No, it's not that slow because 2 5Ks later they ran 16:01.
Exactly.
So do the math here. They dropped almost 2 minutes between the first and third 5K.
Yeah. Yep, they ramped it up to 16:01 in their third 5K, so by 15K, and that narrowed the field to only 10 women at that point. In fact, Emma Bates did not make the big surge, and she was 7 seconds back, and then she ended up reeling it back in, and she would catch the leaders again, and there was 11 then, so Emma Bates joined that group of 10 at half marathon.
Yep.
So, I mean, I thought, again, Emma Bates, if those of you that know me, I'm always raving about how Emma Bates races.
Because she just does her thing instead of everyone else's.
Exactly. She does her thing. In fact, that's what we interviewed her about. I need to link to that because it's a very interesting inside of Emma Bates' head. And it's how to make in-race decisions with Emma Bates. It's a good episode.
So contrast that. I don't want to cut you off, but this is how Emma Bates approaches this kind of stuff at the highest level. We'll get to how she finished in a moment, but in the race commentary, Meb Keflezighi was giving race commentary. He's the most recent U.S. man to win the Boston Marathon, and so they're talking about this very thing. And he says you can't run your own race at this level. You have to run everyone else's race. And I hear him say that, and I'm like, there's a few people here in this race right now that would argue that point, would disagree with
Scott
you.
Fauble.
Scott Fauble being one who finished 7th after running his own race entirely. He was never doing anything based on what the leaders
He's
were
like,
doing.
I can't run that fast for the first half marathon. I
And
just
he
straight up
wouldn't anyway.
shouldn't do that.
Yeah,
he said I
anyway.
shouldn't run that fast for the first half marathon.
And then you bring up, so that's Scotty Fauble, certainly, but Emma Bates as well. And it didn't go too badly for her either.
It didn't. Well, we'll continue to tell you how this unfolded. During the downhill 22nd mile, they split a 5:08.
That's very fast.
Yes, that further narrowed the field. And at this point, and I can just give you a few of the names, but Bariso, Yashana, Obiri, we have Jepkosky, Salpeter, Bates. Like, those are a few of them that are in it.
Big names.
Big names. So Bates then ended up leading for a while.
Yeah, well, so this is what's so fascinating. At this point, late in the race, she finds herself in first, and no one else wants to take it from her, and she's got no problem doing it.
Emma Bates also likes to stay out of trouble.
Okay.
So if she's in front, she's in less trouble.
So like when Joycelyn Jepkosky tripped, or was it Yashana who tripped? Who went down? They tripped on each other. Yashana went down, tripping with Jepkosky. So when Yashana falls, for instance, at the 24th mile, you're saying Bates is
she ended up
during that time.
Well, so after that, she actually moved to the outside, and she wasn't even in the pack.
For a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, she moved to the outside of the pack because she just wanted to stay out of that trouble, which I don't like that kind of racing experience either, where everyone's running on top of each other. That's why track can be so intense sometimes.
I actually kind of find it a little bit exciting.
Ooh, I get tense, so it's harder for me to relax, and I run so much better when I'm relaxed.
Yeah, that too.
As the final stages unfolded, Bates was out of podium finish positioning because there was a big surge that happened. She was still running really strong. It was just that the other women took off. But she did end up finishing, this is exciting news to share, 5th as the top American. And she also ran a personal best time of 2:22:10.
That's awesome.
To give you perspective
at
Boston, and to give you some perspective, everyone's complaining about the qualifying world standards of all the events because they have been notched down significantly.
What?
The qualifying standard for the marathon is 2:29:30. Emma ran 2:22:10.
Yeah.
Like, just to give you some perspective of how well under that standard she is.
Yeah, I mean, listen, American women marathoners have no problem qualifying for the highest level competition. No problem at all. They're all running way faster than that time. But there's certainly plenty of other events where the times are
what I'm
a
saying
little bit
is
harder.
It's strong. I was
Yes.
giving some perspective
Her
on how
race
far
was
under
strong.
she is. So yeah, her race was very strong. Yababel Yashana, she fell, as we mentioned, during mile 24, but she stayed in the lead pack, which
She
was
got right up and got caught right back up to him.
bounced back up with a vengeance, it kind of looked like. Just after 40K, Obiri broke away, and she ended up winning in kind of a lot compared to like how much of a pack there was for being so close to the end. So she ended up winning by 12 seconds.
Yeah.
And her time was 2:21:38.
So you just quick note there. Then Emma Bates ended up only 32 seconds behind first place. She didn't lose much time when they started pulling away.
It was more just they had a little bit more fire in their legs. Bariso was second in 2:21:50. Salpeter was third in 2:21:57. And Yashana, who fell, was fourth in 2:22 flat.
Yeah. But how about Helen Obiri?
How about Helen
marathon
Obiri?
after a disappointing, was it New York that she ran? After a disappointing New York, she comes back and wins Boston.
Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, I'm going to go to the end of like our notes here because I think it's relevant as we gear up for this conversation. But Dathan was saying that the best thing that could have happened, like maybe one of the best things that could have happened to her was having a difficult New York marathon because she grew in her respect in the marathon. And he said she didn't miss a single aid station this time. She went out extremely patient and followed all of the race plan that they had discussed beforehand. And he said that she usually gets pretty eager. And so she's a really fast track runner. Of course she gets eager.
Even
she
on
has,
track, though, she was the one who wanted to be pushing and charging early.
So the wisdom that we see here in her executing so well and then winning this really prestigious marathon in her second marathon is remarkable.
I mean, she's being tutored by
She is being tutored by the
finest,
yeah, Dathan Ritzenheisen.
Dathan Ritzenheisen,
You know,
as
they
the
said
announcer said. Dathan
like,
Ritzenheisen, her coach, and I'm like, who's that?
Yeah, so that I thought that was kind of a neat little tidbit to know from Dathan. I love how Let's Run listed Helen Obiri's accolades: track star, cross country star, Boston Marathon champion. So diverse.
Yeah, so Helen Obiri has done what only a few runners over the years have ever done. I should mention Kipchoge is in this crowd too, but she has been a gold medalist in all of the disciplines of running. On the road in the marathon, which is gold in terms of winning a marathon majors, but as marathoners know, Boston counts and on the level of things like world championships and stuff for sure. Track, cross country, she's done all of the areas.
Yep, which is really, really impressive to see how much of a range that she has. So she said that the reason that things were so good for her was that she waited instead of leading. So that was just reaffirming that strategy for her. I did want to give a brief shout out to previous guest Erica Kemp, who ran her marathon debut. She ran a strong race on a difficult course on a difficult day to have your first marathon, and she was 2:33 and change.
All right. Well done, Erica Kemp. A quick note here, because the Rotterdam Marathon was also happening this weekend. Overshadowed a little bit in publicity, but at the same time,
well, here, at least here in the U.S.
Yeah, true. But the Rotterdam Marathon is known to be a fairly quick course, and so a lot of times you get runners heading out there to run some fast times, including race winner, his second victory, Bashir Abdi, in a 2:03:47. Abdi's run around that time a number of times, and including the last time was 11 seconds faster, so he's right near his best on the course too. Very strong performance there. Abdi, part of the NN running, like with Kipchoge's group and such.
I didn't realize that.
Yep. So he's been doing great, and will continue to be one to watch in all of these, especially when he goes up in the majors and those ones too.
And racing Abdi was very beneficial for runner-up Timothy Kiplagat because it pulled him to a big personal best. He ran 2:03.50 and is a personal best by 90 seconds, which I know doesn't sound like a lot in the marathon, but when you're getting that close to the 2-hour mark, that's significant.
90 seconds is hard to come by at that point.
And big shout out to Futsum Zena Selassie, previous podcast guest, who ran 2:09.40. And he got 11th place. Very strong running for Futsum. And that does qualify him, too, for the world standard in the marathon.
Yeah, just got to get through the trials, and he's got a very strong chance as well. Well, a lot of excitement. We just have enjoyed thoroughly our time immersed in the exciting running stuff that's going on. But perhaps more even than that we enjoy is immersing our time and attention in interactions with other runners. And
our athletes.
That includes all of you listening, and yes, certainly why we do the things we're doing. So to keep those interactions alive and in charge, make sure you're asking questions for the Q&A episode at the end of each month so we can have the most relevant things to share for all of you. AtoZrunning.com/question. Or comment on all the places where you interact with our content. If you're on socials, which is a place I think we have things, comment on those things and share your thoughts, experiences, ideas, and questions, and or anywhere else. And that's what's fun. That's what's good.
We love it. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week.